right, here we go. Can you guys hear me? Can everyone hear me? Yeah. Katie is good.
Perfect.
All right. So, good morning, everyone. My name is Monica Rocha Antonin, and I'm a coordinator for the Accelerated Career English at Holyoke Community College. My presentation today is about adding diverse learning identities in pronunciation classes, the role of translanguaging. Okay, before I start that, I'm going to talk about myself a little bit and my experience, which is extremely diverse. And this new approach to teaching pronunciation is something that I've learned in my professional career. I worked with as K through 12 ESL teacher in the state of Connecticut for 10 years, and I am a certified K through 12 ESL TESOL in Connecticut, in the state of Connecticut. I'm also Spanish certified, and I speak Portuguese and I speak German. So I have several languages going on in my brain at the same time. And I myself went through several language learning experiences. First of all, I'm from Brazil. I came to the US when I was 19 years old. I was an international student. I attended college in the US. I didn't have any ESL support when I was in college, so I had to figure out by myself how to learn English, academic English for my schooling, and it was a very interesting experience. And I'm also an English language learner myself. So, and then later on in life, in my 40s, I moved to Germany and I became another second language learner. I added another language to my repertoire, and I also had to learn the language of the land. So I've experienced learning a second language two times in my life. So I've had first-hand experience with this, and some issues about pronunciation that I think are very important, and for us ESL professionals to be aware of and to be conscious of. How does the language learner react when you correct their pronunciation all the time? So there's a lot of, there's an emotional component to that. So over time, I think we have learned that correcting pronunciation on the spot is not the proper way of addressing learning. And of course, I'm in this sense, I'm preaching to the choir here. We all know that, but I think today what I like to do is to present some techniques about how to approach pronunciation in the context of translanguaging. Okay, all right. So because we are a very large room, I have decided that it's better to type in your answers on the chat. So Katie is going to be moderating the dialogue between myself and the chat, and whatever you guys write on the chat. Okay, so first of all, I would like to know, what do you know about translanguaging? And what do you want to learn today about translanguaging? Can you please type in just a few words on the chat?
Annalene writes that she's interested in what's new in this great topic. And Ashley also wrote, I'm not very familiar either. Is it using your language skills from all of your languages to communicate? Lindsay says, I'm not familiar with this topic either. My understanding is that it's native language to understand new language.
Okay. One more, and then you guys, we can answer that later on, okay? So anything you write on the chat is going to be addressed after the presentation as well. Okay, any other responses?
One more now. Emily says, I have a lot of students who use the skill in the classroom and I want to know how to best support them.
Excellent. I hope I can help you today. Okay, all right, so let's move on. So I have some more questions for you. First question is, how many American accents are there? Can you name them? Second question, How many countries in the world, you don't have to answer all of them, but at least one of them. How many countries in the world speak English as the main language, not as the native language, as the main language? And question number 3, how many people in the world speak English as a native language? This is Jeopardy questions.
So Priscilla writes Chicago. I think that's for the American accents.
Right.
Aline says, we all have an accent. I have no idea of the numbers. Karen says 6.
Good. Right. So officially it's 6, actually, officially, but you can have as many locally as possible, you know, so officially there are 6 American accents, but anyway, good. How many countries in the world speak English as the main language? Anybody knows that?
Oh, Lindsay also says for American accents, there's Boston.
Boston, New York.
For the next question, I'm seeing 8, 3. Oh, and someone else says, yes, south of Boston and north of Boston are 2 different varieties.
I love this. This is fascinating.
Diane says 40 countries for the second question.
Okay. That's a hard one, though. That's a really hard one. Let's jump on to the next one. How many people in the world speak English as a native language? Anybody has an idea? Well, just a number, figure.
Lots of feedback on the first question. Mary Lou's saying there's also the Rhode Island accent, which is true.
Great, I love it.
Not seeing anything for the third question yet.
No? Okay, so let me move on, all right? Okay, so we can address those later on, all right? So yeah, so officially, of course, you have North Boston, South Boston, but officially 6 because of they're separated into regions. And then of course, there are several varieties within those. So in other words, the answer to that, English as the main language, not as a native language, are 67 countries and 27 non-sovereign entities. How many people in the world speak English as a native language? 400 million. Okay, so here's a picture of the world map. Okay, so you have an idea more or less. I did this color-coded so you can see. The green ones are what we call the Anglosphere. Now, the countries where English is the native language official. The blue ones are official as a majority language, like Canada, for example, is an example of that. In Canada, of course, you have French. And the orange one is co-official as a majority language. And the purple one is co-official as a minority language. So you have different varieties of English spread out all over the world, but each one of them are either de facto or de jure. Okay, so it's a very widespread language. There are many varieties of English. So anyhow, so we focus on English first and the different accents. So now we're going to jump into the next topic here, which is some definitions. So now I'm going to give you some theory. Okay. All right. So the thing is, so translanguaging, some of you have an idea more or less of what translanguaging is. Translanguage is an approach to language teaching and learning that recognizes and values the linguistic resources that multilingual individuals bring into the classroom. So in other words, translanguaging deals with different aspects of human expression, not only verbal language, but also different forms of expressions, multisemiotic, multisensory. So you have different resources for communicating. Like, for example, I could consider gesturing a form of translanguaging. When you cannot communicate with the language, you can use some symbols and some signs to communicate. When you travel into a country where the language is so different, and you say, well, they don't speak English, how can I communicate? For example, you go to a restaurant, you go to a restaurant all over the world, and when it's time to pay the bill, you can just go like this, and they will know what it is. So there's some sort of universal form of language that can be used to an extent in the classroom. Now, so in the classroom becomes a lot more elaborate, but translanguage is an example of, it's a concept that includes all of human forms of expression. Okay, so let's talk about the pedagogy of translanguaging, and I'm gonna quote here Jim Cummins. When I did my master's at Fairfield University, my master's in TESOL, he was one of the main guys that I quoted in my master thesis from the University of Toronto. So according to him, translanguage as a pedagogy in the classroom can challenge the devaluation of emerging bilingual learners. So a lot of work has been coming out since 2011 in this area. And right now it's sort of a trendy concept, but I'm gonna play a little bit of a video here with Jim Cummins talking about this, okay?
Make a move.
You have to deal with the ads for 1 second. Can you guys see it?
Yes.
Yep.
When a student comes to school speaking a language other than the dominant school language, that's part of his or her identity. That's part of who they have been up to this point in time. Some students come to school speaking multiple languages. Many students may have been in refugee camps in different countries. They may have been in schools in different countries. They've learned multiple languages. And when that kind of linguistic capital is not acknowledged within the school, it's shutting off a lot of their accomplishments as not being relevant. And that communicates a message to the student that what they are is a second language learner of Swedish or English, an incompetent speaker of those languages in the early stages. Somebody who can't understand the textbooks and at the grade level. And so that's a process of negotiating identities, that if the teacher is not aware of the importance of language for the way students feel about themselves, it can have a very negative effect on the extent to which students will be willing to engage academically. And so rather than seeing students as multilingual students who have a variety of linguistic accomplishments, who have maybe had a wide range of experiences, who have got to Sweden or got to Canada based on their extraordinary intelligence, their initiative, their ability to survive and their resilience. We see students sometimes only as somebody who needs help, somebody who is deficient in the language of instruction. And when we put students into that identity cocoon, we risk diminishing them in terms of who they are and who they can be. And we know also that those teacher expectations can get internalized by the students. And many of them will say, well, I'm not that bright. I'm not ever going to make it to high school. I'm not going to make it to college or university. Why bother making the effort? I'll go out and try and become a mechanic or do something relatively low level in terms of professional qualifications within the society. And so when teachers understand more about the crucial role that language and language learning plays in students' sense of self and in their academic aspirations, then I think they can look at ways of communicating to students that their multilingualism or their knowledge of their home language is an important intellectual accomplishment. It's something that they should cherish, that they should continue to develop. It's important also to communicate this message to parents, because parents don't know this. And so when we look at the role of language, the role that language plays in identity, there's all kinds of implications for how we interact with students and how we organize the curriculum. And this is not just at the level of the individual teacher, it's at the level of the school. Does the school have a policy in relation to students' multilingualism? Is the implicit policy communicated to students that they should leave their languages, their cultures at the schoolhouse door, that they're not really relevant in the school environment? That's incredibly diminishing of communities and individual students. And schools that take a much more positive orientation to students' multilingualism, bring it into classroom, encourage students to carry out work in their home languages as well as in English or Swedish or whatever the school language might be. For example, through writing dual language books, tend to succeed much better because students are feeling acknowledged for their accomplishments. They adopt a much more positive attitude towards their home language. They're more curious about their parents' cultural background and their experiences. And students, these schools are vibrant places. And teachers are happier in these schools.
Audiences agree. Transformers is back. And
I'm going to have to stop for a second here because I got stuck on YouTube. All right. Little technical issue. All right. Okay, let me go back here. Sorry about that. Okay. All right. So YouTube always does that trick with you. All right. So you've heard Jim Cummings, which is always one of my, always been one of my favorite. Let me go back. So how do I go back here? Okay. Sorry, I've lost the, okay, here we go. All right. So let me go back here. So in other words, translanguage pedagogy, broadly understood, is an idea of using the student's full linguistic repertoire. So for example, for college, ESL, for example, college level ESL, a student might have really a good educational background from their countries, or they attended college, or they started attending college. And the students whose parents read to them every day, if they're in K through 12, they have a very strong first language form of communicating. And then those students are, that kind of linguistic repertoire is something that can be utilized in the ESL classroom. So the research community right now is really endorsing the idea of using those skills, okay? So how did translanguaging came into becoming what it is right now? I think when I did my research, a lot of it came out of bilingualism, bilingual education, which is possible in some instances, but not when you have so many different languages in the classroom. But the bilingual education, I did a lot of reading on Ofelia Garcia's bilingual education in the 21st century. And I'm going to quote her here, and I'm also going to share with you a video of her presenting on this topic, just a 1-minute video. She's from CUNY, City University of New York, teacher training program. So one of the things that she talks about is the complexity of the global community. I mean, if you think about your programs, I don't know how, I know we had so many school districts represented here, but we have such a variety of languages coming into our classroom. So it's not as simple to say that, oh yeah, I'm going to everybody's just gonna present this curriculum that's been working for a long time. Things have evolved, things have changed. So being able to adapt and present different language possibilities of using L1 in the classroom have been validated. So I'm going to share this website with you, okay? And this is going to be available. So I think for the K through 12 teachers, this is a very good website and resource. So I'm going to play her for a little bit.
The monolingual teacher has to, of course, rely a lot more on the children themselves, on the community and the parents, on texts that they can bring in, on technology to support the learning, so that they have to do things differently. But today, with all our technology, with Google Translate, and with, again, I'm saying this, with a positioning of being a co-learner, so that you have a stance that you can also learn from the children, because the children are bringing in features and understandings that you don't have. Then if it's a two-way street, of course, one can translanguage. And I would say it's the only way to make meaning, and it is the one thing that everybody needs to do in order to be to successfully develop their language, develop their ways of knowing, develop content, develop their social, emotional identities. And of course, I think for society, developing a more just society, a more equitable society that does not establish these linguistic hierarchies in which we often perform. So that's as far as teachers who are monolinguals or English medium education. The idea, of course, is that even if you are a teacher in an English medium school, if you have children who bring other language resources, then you have to start there in order to extend them. You can't just ignore them and think that the children are going to appropriate this new language without reference to what they already have.
Okay, all right. So this one is, yeah, okay, all right. So yeah, so in other words, you can see this. All right. So question is, how does translanguaging emerge in the ESL classroom? So that's the big question here. In my experience is that it's an organic process. You know, it's almost like this idea of allowing for things to happen and then taking advantage of this organic process and capitalizing on it, okay? Translanguaging should be encouraged by teachers and professors. And the most important point here is it emerges in the negotiation between speakers. So it has to do with intelligibility. So in other words, what you're looking for is the ability for students to understand each other, for you to understand the students, and for the students to understand you at this sort of middle ground of negotiation. Do we understand each other? Okay. Speakers retain their own cultural identity while engaging in translanguaging. They align themselves and their diverse language resources to facilitate communication. This one applies more to older students. So I'm trying to address like K through 12 and adult and college education here at the same time, okay? So this one here applies more to college ESL students or adult education. So in my opinion, this is my own writing here, this whole process occurs within the context of the classroom, and it's linked to the participants and the role of pragmatics and contextuality. So each classroom is a different entity. So you cannot just say, oh, you know, this classroom, I'm going to just repeat the same thing that I did with this one, with this other one, because the linguistic varieties in your classrooms are going to be different. So it's important to adapt, but to keep those things in mind, that the intelligibility and the communication facilitation of communication is the most important thing. Okay, so now comes so you understand what translanguaging is. So my question is, few questions here. How do you deal with diverse or bilingual accents in the ESL classroom? So if you're teaching pronunciation, if the students have to do a presentation, how do you deal with that? So can you type in the chat? And then the second one, be honest, your own opinion, how important is correct pronunciation in the ESL classroom? And what kinds of issues do you run into when you correct your students' pronunciation? I'm going to give you a couple of minutes to answer that. Katie will help you by reading your answers back.
Yep. Okay, so Lillian writes, we can model standard, in quotes, standard pronunciation by repeating what the student said in the target pronunciation without pointing out the error, also in quotes. Lindsay says, I'm in a K3 school. Pronunciation isn't that important in my classroom. We practice certain digraphs together so no one feels left out. And Aline says, I think this is for the second question. We can say nothing if the pronunciation doesn't interfere with comprehensibility. Oh, lots of stuff coming in. Emily, stop me when you want, Monica. Emily says, when students are overly corrected, it can impact their confidence in the classroom or their drive to try new things and take risks. I prioritize students trying to use the new vocabulary or academic language and model pronunciation and practice vocabulary pronunciation whole group. Ellen says, I always focused on intelligibility. For example, pronunciation causes problems in understanding for adult students. Diane, I typically don't correct pronunciation, but we do practice pronunciation as a whole class. Bonnie Esther, when we are showing patterns during English instructional time, such as the difference between gross and grows, it is important to show this, but stopping to correct along the way should be avoided. And Ashley says, many of my students want to speak, in quotes, like an American. I help them if they want, but I tell them they are speaking like an American because there is no one way we speak. But I do speak like a Bostonian for their amusement. For the most part, I really work on pronunciation if there is a mistake that leads to a different word. Speech in a Spanish accent is a lot of fun. And Karen says, if pronunciation is not comprehensible, I think it's very important.
Excellent. You guys are doing the right thing already. You're all doing the right thing. Very good. Okay, so let's move on to the next thing. All right. So yeah, we already talked about this, and I'm not going to play this video because we don't have time. But if you watch this video later on, is the hoi toi accent. You know, it's a southern accent from a particular island in North Carolina, where they speak a sort of English, a variety of English that it's almost impossible to understand. Okay, so in other words, I'm comparing different American accents with the kinds of beans. You know, look at the many beans that you have. You're going to say, I'm going to eat beans, but what kind of beans are you going to cook tonight? I mean, look, there's such a variety of it, you know. So variety is the spice of life. So you can come and watch this later. So we already talked about this a little bit. So great. So we talked about how we deal with accent in the classroom. So let's talk about accent negotiation. Of course, for the younger, the K through 12 students, there's good news and bad news. Okay, the good news is, and I've done a lot of research on this. I've heard this one time on NPR, and I had to do a lot of reading on it. And research has shown, in fact, that most accents become permanent at age 12 due to the articulation mechanisms of the mouth musculature. So in other words, a person like me who came to the US at age 19, I'm going to have an accent for the rest of my life. However, if you're a child and your parents came here and you spoke English in school, more than likely you're going to pick up the American accent, regardless of your pronunciation by the time you come in. But still, you know, there's the accent in the classroom. So how do you do that? So negotiating accent refers to the process of addressing and accommodating the accents of non-native speakers in the ESL classroom. It involves recognizing and valuing linguistic diversity while aiming for effective communication and mutual understanding. Again, back to the intelligibility issue. As long as I can understand, it's fine. But then we also say, but I'm their English teacher. They're saying this so wrong. What can I do to help them? There are things that you can do to help them by being respectful at the same time. Okay, so so you as a teacher, you're their learner and the facilitator. Learners work collaboratively. You create the conditions for a safe learning space, and the interactions within cultures take place. Okay, all right. So how should pronunciation be taught within this context? In other words, pronunciation today, the way we understand and the way we have evolved into translanguaging, it's not accent training. Mimicking the teacher does not work in language retention. However, if you are an elementary school teacher and if you're teaching the vowel sounds, that's a whole other story. Okay, again, I am addressing different audiences here. So take the one that applies to you and walk away with it. And some of it might not apply to you, okay? Pronunciation should be taught focusing on intelligibility and contextual understanding. Pronunciation drills do not work in the multilingual ESL classroom. I remember when I was younger, I was teaching for, in San Diego, was one of my jobs teaching for Mexican immigrants. And I would spend a long time trying to teach them how to do the th, and we would be repeating that in the classroom. And these were adult students, and we'll be repeating that. And then at the end of the day, the next day they come back and nothing worked, they could not pronounce things the way. So we had to kind of, I intuitively knew that this was not working, even though I had not been into contact with this concept of translanguaging. But I understood at that time that my drills were not working. They just would not work. So I took a different approach to it. So, but the most important thing here is to remember in terms of culture, interculturality, is that promoting predominant acceptable media standardized American accents raises equality issues and promotes native speakerism. Okay, so I quoted this word from Adam Scott from England. He did a fantastic presentation on this topic, and I drew a lot of information from his presentation, which was within the context of England, which is sort of similar to what we're dealing with here. Okay, so here are some suggestions. Pronunciation awareness. It's important to make them aware of it. And how do you do that? You can provide them guidance on specific pronunciation challenges based on their native language. For example, the Spanish speakers, Y and J, okay? So that's making them aware of that, okay? Like, for example, Portuguese, Brazilian Portuguese, the TH, Brazilians tend to drop the TH. So you sort of understand each language that you have in the classroom. Ukrainian, Russian students, I have a lot of them in my classroom right now. They tend to drop the article. Yeah? So you make them aware that they need to use articles for specific words, the article the article a. So it's sort of making them aware of that as a particular, understanding the languages that you have in the classroom and their particular challenges. And if you are dealing with K through 12, you have the students all year long, so you have plenty of opportunities to do that, okay? Error correction. So here, stress on patterns and intonation is more important than accent correction. So this will enhance their confidence in their spoken English. So in other words, it's not just about letting them go on, but it's actually focusing on the specific things that they need. Error correction, addressing pronunciation errors without undermining the student's confidence. So the idea is to focus on promoting self-correction. So let the students correct themselves, model a little bit within the context of their language, and then allow them to correct themselves. So a lot of students love to do that, okay? All right, so some other activities that you can do, community activities. They can engage in pair or group work, where they can listen and imitate different accents. So there's sort of a fun thing to do for younger students. Code switching, switching between languages in the classroom. Also, teachers can allow students to use their L1 when they're struggling to express themselves in English. We have so many resources right now, okay? Bilingual or multilingual word walls is another idea to create bilingual word walls in the classroom that display key vocabulary words, collect classroom pronunciation patterns, and agree on intelligibility. For example, with the bilingual word wall, let me go back. Sorry, I'm gonna go back. Oops, sorry. All right, with the bilingual word wall, you can do like, okay. Help me here, how do I go back? Oh, here we go. Sorry, guys. Sorry, okay, here we go. Sorry. The bilingual word wall, I taught a Portuguese class. this semester, just for English learners. I had a bilingual word war in my Portuguese class because I didn't expect my students who were adults to know all the words in Portuguese. They were beginners. So we had that going on in the classroom all the time. So that's another idea. Okay, so now we have another fun activity here. How do you pronounce these words? Please add to the chat in the way you would sound them out.
I'll do my best to read what you put in the chat. I see Gloucester, or a Gloucester, Worcester, Weymouth, Gloucester, Worcester, Weymouth, Gloucester, Worcester, Weymouth, Gloucester, Worcester, Weymouth, Weymouth, Worcester. Stop me whenever you like.
All right, I'm going to tell you how I would read them as a second language learner. Gloucester, Worcester, Weymouth. So I'm speaking from a person who just confronted these words as a non-English speaker, as an English learner, and not understanding. So you see how contextual the whole thing is, you know? So it's very interesting. I was just curious. All right, thank you. Okay, so let's talk about translanguaging in the multiple ESL classroom. You can also create language buddies, pair students with different L1 backgrounds together. I did this in my reading and writing credit ESL language here at Holyoke Community College last semester. I had students who were Russian speakers, and I had students who were Spanish speakers, and I put them into groups to work out some issues within the text together. Sometimes I find it very interesting. They can do some multilingual presentations. They can do projects. For example, if they are doing a group project, maybe they can do parts of the project using their L1. And so other students who have L1, if there is a predominant language in your classroom, maybe they can utilize that depending on the context and the level that you're teaching. So students in their L1 can understand their presentations. This is very useful. I did that a lot when I was teaching abroad. I taught in Germany for 7 years. Vocabulary translation exercises. They're asked to translate English words or phrases into their L1, okay? So that will help them to deepen their understanding of English vocabulary. Yes, so they're using the L1, heritage language integration. If you have only Spanish speakers in your classroom, that's something that you can do. Teach content and discuss cultural aspects using their L1, okay? So maintaining the connection with their culture is important. And that one, I think, applies more to K through 12. Okay, so here, this is really cool. There's a translanguage curriculum from CUNY University, and you can access that. That's a link here that I left for you. You can have a word wall in your classroom with different, for example, if you're using the first 100 words that the students are learning, well, that's first grade, but higher levels, let's say middle school, high school, you can use a multilingual word wall in your classroom. And that's one thing that works really well. And by looking at this curriculum here, there's some very good tips for K through 12 teachers. This one, I use this one in my reading and writing class. And this one works really well for reading, writing, and speaking, where the students will take an excerpt from the text, write it in your own words, in your own language, and then you can write in your own language, translation, home language, and then write it in your own words in English. So you learn to summarize, okay? So you do L2 to L1, and then you do summary, and then you can read it aloud and practice your pronunciation. That's something that applies to the adult ESL classroom. Okay, now this is fun. You can use emojis. You know, I find emojis to be fascinating, you know, especially with the younger learners. You know, you can establish some emojis that communicate, especially if they just arrived and they cannot communicate, and you can use that. And I've used emoji with some of my adult students who are having a hard time expressing their emotions. So that's something that you can use. Some teachers have used emojis for their chemistry classes. You can see here, students can really connect with that. So that's the one thing that you can do. Okay. All right. So I'm almost finished here. So here are the key takeaways. Explore speech sounds in your classroom. Learn about your students, find out the patterns of pronunciation, avoid using models and mimicking, negotiate meaning and intelligibility, accommodate differences, use pragmatic strategies depending upon the situation. So get to know your students, and each situation probably requires a different approach. Shared understanding to co-construct meaning, utilize resources available to facilitate communication and intelligibility. Okay, and questions, and here are my sources. So I'm going to stop here. And yeah, okay, so I'm ready to share. If you guys want to turn your camera on, of course, we're being recorded here, so it's fine. But I would be very glad to answer questions that you may have.
And yeah, and feel free to put any questions in Whova and I'll read them to Monica. Oh, there's a few comments about the Worcester, Gloucester, Weymouth activity. Aileen says, my mother always said Worcester and she was from Brockton. And Sarah said that's also how she pronounced them when she moved here. And Ashley says she does this activity with them, but then she makes them give her towns in their countries and she tries to pronounce them.
Right, right. Excellent. There's not a possibility of us to have a discussion here, like for them to turn their camera on and actually ask questions. Is it possible now, Katie?
I can enable that, yeah.
Okay,
You can all turn on your cameras. I can turn on.
Yeah, just now it's for the questions, you know, if you have any.
Sure. Yeah, if anyone wants to come off mute and ask a question directly, that's also an option.
I did want to ask a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
So I'm an ESL teacher, so I do these kinds of things in my classroom. But I find that we're having a problem in our schools of a lot of gen ed teachers not understanding this concept and kind of just relying on only the L1 translation. Like, here's a Google Translate of what we're doing. Go have fun. So how would you approach a topic like this to tell the gen ed teacher that, like, it's okay to use that as support and it's okay to embrace that, you know, but you also want them to do that next step of somehow negotiating it in English, like doing the in your own language and then translating to English. How would you approach that?
That's a very good question. I think it would be hard to, you know, I think that's a level of professional training that they need to get. You know, they need to get some professional training. If you have a certain percentage of students in your school who are minority language speakers, who have L2s, you know, if you have many L's in your classroom, that needs to be addressed at, I think, at a professional development level, because that's a awareness, that's like a subconscious bias that they have of not wanting to walk that extra step. So I think that's an important thing to address at a level of training, because, you know, you can try to elicit empathy from them for the students, but that doesn't mean that they will necessarily adhere to the policies, you know. So I think that's a school-wide issue that needs to be addressed in some form of professional training. So I think that's my best advice in that level. I mean, you can, if you have one that you connect well with, then maybe you can talk to them and give them some tips. You know, any good teacher should be able to adapt this materials. That's part of good teaching. You don't have to be an ESL specialist to be able to adapt this, but you have to be open-minded, you have to be willing, and if they're not willing, then that has to be addressed at the level of professional training, in my opinion. Okay.
All right, thank you very much.
You're welcome. Any other questions?
Hi.
Hi.
Hello. I just want to say that I really liked this conference because for a long time in the United States, the translanguaging seemed to be discouraged, but having lived in a place like Canada, the translanguaging is more encouraged there because it's a dual language speaking country. And so I like that this movement of languaging is being more encouraged in the United States. And as far as pronunciation, I do agree with you that I like how, that focusing on the accents isn't as crucial as it used to be. I do think it's important though, like for example, I used to be a French teacher and then I'm ESL teacher and I've worked with Haitian Creole speakers. So like if you see something like the CH in English, that would be like a sh in French. Just to put, like, and you had you had mentioned the Spanish and Portuguese differences with different, and I believe Russian with different letters and diphthongs and things. So I think pointing some of the phonics out could be important just to get that pronunciation down. I just wanted to make those comments, but I really love that it's becoming more acceptable to have different accents and to use the translanguaging in general. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your feedback. It's so interesting to know about Canada, that they're ahead of us in terms of that because it's a bilingual country. And so they are ahead of the US in terms of translanguaging in the classroom. And great. Thank you so much, Lisa. Any more questions? No? Okay. Anyone else has a question, a comment? Please feel free. Okay. I just wanted to say, as an English language learner myself, when I was in Germany, let me explain to you, I also had to learn German and I was in my 40s. And at first I resisted it so much because I was teaching English and Spanish. I was teaching for a university and I taught for a school for a while. And then I was like, for my first 2 years there, I could not possibly learn the language. I had a resistance to it. And then I said, no, if I'm going to stay here, I have to learn the language. So I started studying the language. And one of the things that I appreciated very much about being in Germany is that Germans are very kind with their language because it's such a difficult language that if you make an effort to express yourself, you go to the supermarket and you're trying to speak their language, they're so appreciative. They negotiate meaning on the spot because they say, okay, you are walking my way. You're trying to learn my language. And I'm very grateful that you are trying to. So I felt very encouraged by that. And so I was very sort of my affective filter was very low because I felt very encouraged by those experiences that I had learning a second language in a new country because of that particular feedback that I've gotten as an adult where I wasn't being corrected. Whereas on the other hand, I still have, after having lived in the US for 30 years, I still have friends that tend to correct my English. And I find that very annoying because, like, for example, the city, the other day I said, I want to visit Lennox. And then this friend says, Lennox. So, those kinds of things, it's a small thing. I mean, I don't care. I have a very thick skin. I've been teaching for 20 years. So, but I find those things to be like, you know what I'm saying? Do you understand what I'm coming from here? I'm an adult, I speak the language fluently. I have an accent. I make some mistakes here and there, but having a person that's correct you, for a small little thing, unless I ask you, I said, how do I say that? And I'm humble enough to ask, how do I pronounce this? Because sometimes I don't know. It's so I'm just giving you some feedback from the perspective of a language learner who's been through the experience 2 times. And anyhow, okay, so without further ado, thank you very much, everyone, for your participation. And please leave some comments on the chat. I'll be very glad to answer any questions you may have. And enjoy the rest of the conference.